Welcome to our UC Davis Mind Institute Facebook Live, where our experts provide information about neurodevelopmental disabilities. April is Autism Awareness and Acceptance Month, and today we'll be learning about a unique, comprehensive effort that is unlike anything else in the world. We're talking about the Autism Phenome Project. It started at the Mind Institute in 2006. The goal of this long-term study is to partner with families to identify subtypes of autism and improve interventions and treatments for the challenges associated with autism. I'm Marianne Sharp. Joining me today are three Mind Institute faculty members who are very involved with the Autism Phenome Project, or APP for short. David G. Amaral is a neuroscientist and UC Davis Distinguished Professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and Center for Neuroscience. He is also the Benito Foundation Endowed Chair. He was founding research director of the Mind Institute, and he founded the APP in 2006. Welcome, Dr. Amaral.
Thanks, Marianne.
Christine Wu Nordahl is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences as well. She's a neuroimaging expert and studies brain development in autism across the lifespan. She has spearheaded the neuroimaging efforts of the Autism Phenome Project since it was launched. Welcome, Dr. Nordahl.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
And Marjorie Solomon is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences as well. She is the Buzz Oates and Family Endowed Chair in Lifespan Development in Autism. Dr. Solomon is a clinical cognitive neuroscientist who studies cognitive development in autistic children, adolescents, and adults. Welcome, Dr. Solomon.
Well, thank you, Marianne.
If you have any questions today, we would love to hear them. You can post those in the comments, and then we will answer them toward the end of our discussion. So the Autism Phenome Project, a major undertaking, a partnership with more than 400 families so far. What are the major goals of the project, and what sort of data are being gathered? Let's start with you, Dr. Amaral.
Thanks, Marianne. Well, I think the basis for it is that everybody knows that there are different types of autism that probably have different causes and ultimately will have the best interventions or treatments. But at the moment, it's very difficult when a child is diagnosed to assign them to one particular form of autism. So what the Autism Phenome Project is trying to do is gather enough information over a very large number of families to ultimately be able to define different types of autism so that we can provide families with that additional amount of information when the diagnosis takes place. So in short, the APP starts, we invite families when the child is just initially diagnosed between 2 and 3.5 years of age. And we ask the families to come back because we know that autism changes over time. And so we ask the families to come back initially annually for the first few years, and then periodically after that. And in fact, many of the children who started with us in 2006 are now coming back as teenagers for their 5th assessment at the Mind Institute. What kind of data that we gather is very comprehensive. So not only do we gather their medical records and their educational information and other kinds of information that the families have, but we do carry out an MRI. And as you said, Dr. Nordahl spearheads that effort. We do a very comprehensive behavioral assessment and cognitive assessment to see how they're functioning. And then we do a blood draw where we actually use a sample of their blood to look at a variety of things like their immunology. We also look at the genetics of the individual child. All of these data go into a single database. And again, we use these data to try and come up with different subtypes of autism. The ultimate goal is to be able to more effectively treat individuals with autism to reduce disability. And just at the moment, the problem is that virtually all of the clinical trials that have tried one or more treatments of individuals with autism have failed. But in virtually all of those trials, it becomes clear that some of the participants did pretty well, but many others didn't. And when you combine the ones who did and didn't do well, you end up with a result that is not positive. We would like to be able to select those individuals who do well on a particular trial and focus on them. And we think we'll have a much more positive outcome.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. You mentioned that the earliest participants in the APP are now in their teens. So maybe Dr. Solomon, let's turn to you. What are you hoping to learn by following children from early childhood into adolescence?
Well, we know that adolescence is a really critical and foundational period of development. Adolescence is marked by the onset of puberty. And as we probably all know, when children go through puberty, their bodies change in many ways, and they grow and they mature. And we see massive possibilities for children in that age range. We see potentially not only those physical changes, but also cognitive changes, their ability to engage in abstract reasoning, problem solving, perspective taking really changes. We see big changes in social development. Peer relationships change and become more central. Kids begin to have more intimate relationships with their friends and their partners. Eventually, another kind of unfortunate consequence of this all is that sometimes forms of psychopathology begin to emerge, depression, anxiety, and so forth. So all of this sets the stage for a successful transition into adulthood and maturation of functioning, becoming an independent adult in the world.
Yeah, a difficult period. Absolutely.
A very important one too.
Yeah. We talked about the neuroimaging procedures that are used as part of the APP. And one thing that's really unique is they're inclusive, as inclusive as anything, any study that's been done. And Dr. Nordahl, you have led these efforts. What can you tell us about the ways that you've created these unique procedures that allow you to capture as many autistic children as possible?
Thanks for the question, Marianne. So MRI scans are absolutely amazing. They can give us a highly detailed picture of the brain in as little as 5 to 10 minutes. And we can repeat MRI scans over time so that we can track how a child's brain is growing and changing across childhood and into adolescence. The challenge is that the person getting the scan has to lie perfectly still. So just like when we take photos with a camera, if the participant moves, the image gets blurry and we can't use it. So when we first started the APP, the biggest challenge was figuring out how to get really young children, 2 and 3-year-olds, both with and without autism, to lie still enough for an MRI scan. And it was surprising to us, and it's still surprising to me, but we actually found that most kids can sleep through an MRI scan. So we worked with parents and families, and we developed really successful ways to conduct scans at night when kids are sleeping. And we work with the parents to follow their bedtime routines as closely as possible to do this. We've scanned over 400 kids, probably 800 to 900 scans during natural sleep now. So we're pretty comfortable with how this works. But as APP participants have grown up, scanning during sleep is no longer possible in most kids after around 5 to 6 years of age. And we wanted to follow all of the children in our cohort. So we adapted to develop ways to get MRI scans in kids while they're awake and watching a favorite video or listening to a favorite song. And here YouTube has been really great because lots of kids watch YouTube and we can just stream their favorite content during the MRI scan. It's really important to note that the strategies that we've developed work well with all autistic children, including those with intellectual disability or who are non-speaking. And this is a really important group because many neuroimaging studies will exclude them, thinking that they won't be able to lie through the MRI procedures. But this is a group that we felt we didn't want to leave out of our study, so we've worked in adapted ways, and we've really shown the world what these children can do, and that anybody can really get an MRI scan with enough preparation.
Yeah, really amazing. And I know that you have also been helping even with other studies unrelated to autism with some of these neuroimaging techniques. So yeah, incredible. All right. The APP does include autistic individuals with a wide range of intellectual ability levels, meaning that some, as you mentioned, have significant intellectual disability, whereas others might have more average or even superior intellectual abilities. And some of those have changed over time. I'm wondering how this has helped you in terms of identifying perhaps a subtype of autism. Dr. Solomon?
Yeah, we've actually have been engaged in a series of studies now where we've taken a look Intellectual development and IQ, the measure that is usually used to assess it, has been shown to be a very potent predictor of outcomes. So taking that insight, we decided to look through development at trajectories of IQ. And in our first study, we found that there were about 4 groups of intellectual development between ages 2 and middle childhood, age 8. One group was a group that really had pretty much persistent intellectual disability, actually 2 groups, but less than half had persistent intellectual disability through that 2 to 8-year-old period. But we did find one, and there was one group actually that had persistently average or better IQs. We found one really intriguing group that started with intellectual development in this in the more disabled range, and then actually really grew tremendously in their intellectual development and started to resemble the group of kids who had average or better IQs. So it's been our goal now to take a look at factors that distinguish individuals in these groups, because it can have some really strong clinical consequences. First, in helping families to understand what prognosis might be, and second, helping us to really hone in on more of biological differences between the groups, which may help us target treatment, as Dr. Emerald was talking about, and also just to look at markers of development. So now we're in the process of taking a look at that as we carry it through middle childhood, kind of more into the pre-adolescent period. And what we're seeing is that the trajectories are pretty much staying the same. And we're finding that early social and adaptive communication, adaptive functioning seems to be a very good marker of who's going to go on to develop more typically in terms of intellectual abilities. We also have seen, as some other groups have seen, that repetitive behaviors early in childhood can be a marker of who may go on to develop versus who may not. And also externalizing symptoms. So we're finding predictors, both markers, we're calling the early signs, and then mechanistic kind of predictors early on that might help us to develop interventions and so forth.
Yeah, while there have been a number of significant findings in addition to some of those that you just mentioned, Dr. Solomon. In fact, Dr. Nordahl recently published a paper that rounds up many of them over the past, I guess, 15 plus years of the APP. We're going to post that in the comments, so please check that out if you're looking for a comprehensive review. I thought we could maybe dig down into some of the other specific findings as well. Dr. Nordahl, there were some findings related to gastrointestinal related problems and a link between those and behavior challenges. Could you tell us what you found there?
Sure. Well, anecdotally, parents have told us for a long time that GI symptoms like abdominal pain or constipation are medical problems that their children suffer from. But we also know that not all autistic individuals experience GI problems. And so in the APP, we wanted to identify the subgroup who do suffer from more frequent GI problems, and then better characterize the behavioral challenges that might be associated with these GI problems. So when we looked at the time of enrollment in our study at age 3, we found that almost a third of the autistic children in our study experienced multiple significant GI problems, compared to only about 5% of the non-autistic typically developing children. And we also found that these GI problems were associated with higher rates of self-injurious and aggressive behaviors, as well as sleep and attention problems. And we think this is really important for a couple of reasons. First, it's important for parents and medical professionals to be aware that autistic children may be suffering from GI problems that could be medically treated, and this could potentially alleviate or reduce other challenging behaviors. And secondly, we really want to delve deeper into this subgroup with GI problems to try to understand the link between the gut and the brain and the immune system with the hope of better understanding where these GI problems are coming from and developing treatments to specifically help this subgroup of autistic individuals.
Yeah, it's really fascinating when you start to tease these things out. There have also been a number of significant findings regarding brain size in autistic individuals, those MRIs. Could you, Dr. Emerald, tell us maybe some of those? I know there are, it's a very big question, but could you, tell us a few?
Sure, Marianne, and I think that this is a good example of how the Autism Phenome Project has clarified what we know about autism. So when we first started the Autism Phenome Project, there was this notion, there wasn't a lot of evidence for it, but there was this notion that people with autism have big heads and big brains. But it wasn't clear, how many, was it all people with autism or some proportion? And so again, as Dr. Nordahl said, because our study is very inclusive, we have children who have all levels of intellectual ability with all kinds of co-occurring conditions, we have the opportunity to try and figure out the answer, the real answer to those kinds of questions. So it became pretty clear early on as we started accumulating, I think it was at around our first 100th family, that certainly not all children with autism have the big brain, but some do, for sure. We've definitely replicated that. And as we've continued with our research, we now know that about 15% of boys have a brain that's larger than you would expect for their body size. And interestingly, we don't see this very often in girls. So this seems to be a type, the big brain form of autism seems to be a type of autism that's preferentially seen in boys, number one. There was also sort of a notion in the literature on autism that, maybe the brain was going to be big early on, but then somehow something happened and it went back to normal size as the children got older. But again, because the Autism Phenome Project sees these children throughout life, we could actually see if you have a big brain when you're 3, are you going to have a big brain when you're 6 or 11 or 15? And it turns out the answer is yes. So this type of autism, in terms of having the brain that's larger than we would have expected for the body size, doesn't seem to change over time. And our real goal for doing MRIs is actually trying to associate something in the brain with the child's behavior. So we then analyzed all of our data to see, well, is there something special about these kids who have the big brain form of autism? And the answer, it's more complicated than the answer I'll give you, but is that many of the children that have the big brain, certainly not all, but many of the children have the big brain form of autism, have actually increased challenges. So they tend to have less language function than kids that have a more typical size brain, that typical for their body size. Not only do they have language challenges, but as Marjorie was talking about intellectual ability changing over time, the kids with the big brain form, many again, but not all, tend to be the kids who don't show as much improvement in intellectual function over time. So the field actually now has agreed with us that really is a subset of children with autism who have the big brain form. And one of our goals that we're currently studying is, well, why are they more challenged? What is it about having the big brain form that produces the more challenges? And even more importantly, if we understand that, can we do something early on that would improve the quality of their life and reduce those challenges? So again, this is an example of where by defining a type, you can determine whether they need more or less help in order to have the best quality of life.
Yeah, that's so significant, especially sort of turning the conventional wisdom or what had thought to be the case
right
on its head. Yeah.
There's many dogmas in autism that are not based so much on research, but and this is again what the Mind Institute was set up to do, as well as the Autism Phenome Project, is to provide evidence, research-based evidence for what the reality of the situation is.
That's a great segue. We are discussing the Autism Phenome Project. It's a long-term study and partnership with families aimed at understanding the subtypes of autism and improving interventions and treatments for the challenges associated with autism. If you're just joining us, I am Marianne Sharp, and I am joined by 3 APP experts who are all Mind Institute faculty members. David G. Amaral is a UC Davis Distinguished Professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the Center for Neuroscience. He's also the Benito Foundation Endowed Chair. Christine Wu Nordahl is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. She's a neuroimaging expert and studies brain development in autism across the lifespan. And Marjorie Solomon is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences as well. She is the Buzz Oates and Family Endowed Chair in Lifespan Development in Autism. If you have any questions, please do post them in the comments. Our experts will be happy to answer them toward the end of our discussion. So we've been talking about some of the most significant findings of the Autism Phenome Project so far in terms of subgrouping autism. How about anxiety related findings? We know that's a really common co-occurring condition in autistic individuals. Dr. Solomon, I think this is a good one for you.
Thank you. I'm pleased to answer that. So one of the, as Dr. Amaral was just mentioning, there are a lot of things that are known widely about autism, and we just want to really better understand them. And one of these is that group of kids that you mentioned, and adults, that have really distinct forms of anxiety that very much interfere with their family functioning and their daily life functioning. So here we have a very innovative study that we've been conducting where we've been examining kids with autism, assessing their anxiety very, very, very specifically, and then taking a look at several different interventions that have been designed for children with autism and anxiety. So one of them is a cognitive behaviorally based treatment that's delivered individually. Another is a medication that has been used for a long time in children with anxiety. Safely. And then we've also been including a pill placebo group. So we can do a direct comparison of whether the medication intervention, whether the psychosocial intervention, or whether, pill placebo, which would indicate there's some sort of a placebo effect, is more important here. It's a very unique trial because no other group has yet combined both the psychosocial intervention with a medication trial. And we have a large sample now with very, very well-trained providers. And our hope is to better understand what kind of treatments work and for whom. So,
we could put a link to that study as well in the comments. That's the STAR study.
It is, yep, and that's great.
Yeah, that's excellent. You alluded to this a little bit earlier, Dr. Amaral. I'm wondering if we could maybe elaborate on the fact that some studies have found that the character of the autistic traits of an individual may change over time, and in some cases really significantly. Could you elaborate on that in terms of what that means?
Sure. And I'd like to sort of do a shout out to the graduate student who's been pursuing this, whose name is Einat Weisbart-Bartov. She came to us as a clinical psychologist, and she and many other graduate students and postdocs are spending their time trying to gather the data that we're talking about. So I would like to acknowledge the help that all of our team at the Mind Institute has contributed to this. But she was interested in how the characteristics, as you said, of autism, whether a child is more autistic or less autistic, has more of the characteristics that would indicate that you have autism. And how you do this is we evaluate children in the Autism Phenome Project using what's called the gold standard measure of autism, which is the ADOS, ADOS. It stands for Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. But anyway, it's the way that you determine whether somebody has autism or not. And it has a scale, and it says, how autistic do you look based on criteria? This is a scientific research-based measure. And what we did, since we do this ADOS at each time the family comes in, we can look at changes over time. And in short, what again, the field sort of thought initially that whatever level of autism characteristics you have when you're diagnosed, that's what you're going to have throughout life. And what Anat and the team has found is that that's not true, that more than 50% of the children in the Autism Phenome Project change significantly over time. The good news is that more than 35% of the children actually become less symptomatic or have less characteristics of autism as they get older. So in short, it looks like they're improving over time. Interestingly, again, this seems to be a little bit sexually dimorphic in the sense that what I mean by sexually dimorphic is that it's seen in boys versus girls more or less. And what we find here is that the girls seem to be doing better over time than the boys. Both of them can improve, but the girls improve to a greater degree, or a higher proportion of the girls improve. So we've now followed this over time, and now we're trying to figure out, why do some children with autism show this improvement? We've also found the not so good news is that there's a smaller proportion of children with autism whose autistic characteristics get more prominent. And again, what are the pressures that would lead to their autism becoming more characteristic or more prominent? We don't really know the answer to that now, but there is a whole variety of issues that Anat and others are looking at. And again, I think it's important, for those listening to us to know that you really can't define autism by just taking one snapshot in time. Just like children develop over time and change over time, so do the characteristics of autism develop and change over time. And what we're really trying to do is chart this whole trajectory and find out what leads to the best possible outcome. Also trying to find out what leads to outcomes that are not so good, to determine whether we can do something in order to change one into the other.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the differences between boys and girls, because we hear often, and the numbers show, that girls are diagnosed with autism much less frequently than boys. Have you found differences between autistic boys and girls in the APP? And this is a good one maybe for Dr. Nordahl.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you're right, Marianne. We know that about 4 times as many boys are diagnosed with autism as girls. And unfortunately, most research cohorts reflect this, larger proportion of boys. And most research cohorts have more boys, many more boys in their samples than girls. And so it's a difficult question to actually answer with the research cohorts that we have available to us. So in the APP, the first thing that we had to do was to increase the number of girls in our study. And we did this by initiating the GAIN study, which is an offshoot of the APP that allowed us to recruit more autistic girls into our sample to start looking for similarities and differences between boys and girls. So now we have a more even number of boys and girls in our study, and we can really start to compare and look for differences. In the brain, we've found sex differences in multiple brain structures and networks, including the amygdala and the network of regions that the amygdala is connected to, the corpus callosum, which is a major white matter bundle in the brain that connects the left and right hemisphere, and even in the overall rate of brain growth across childhood, as Dr. Amaral had alluded to before. We don't really see this big brain form of autism in girls as much as boys. And we've also shown that autistic girls have a slower rate of brain growth than non-autistic girls across childhood. And we don't see that difference in boys. So in short, I could go on about this for a long time, but in short, we've shown that we really can't assume that boys and girls with autism are the same, at least in terms of brain development. And we're really interested in identifying how these differences in brain development map onto differences in behavior and outcomes as well.
Okay, we actually have a couple of questions that are related to the most recent comments by Dr. Amaral and Dr. Nordahl, so I think we should get to those. The first one is, how do you know positive changes are from interventions or just from age? I think that's maybe for you, Dr. Amaral.
Yeah, so in the study that we did, we do look at intervention intensity, how much intervention a child received over time. And there was, The part of the problem is that so many children receive so much intervention that it's hard to get a very wide range of differences in intervention. There are very few children who are not getting any intervention nowadays. We did see a slight signal that the more intervention there was, the better off the child did. There's actually a recent paper that has just come out, a multi-site paper that suggests that intervention really is associated with better outcome. That was a paper that I haven't even read the entire paper, but I did read the abstract, and that's what it indicates, is going in that direction. But there's other, so age is certainly a factor, but I think there are many, many variables, many factors that go into determine whether a child is going to do better or not do so good. And, there's different social pressures. So a child can be doing well before they go to school, and then go to school, and all of a sudden they're now dealing with all kinds of new social pressures, peer interactions, trying to get along with the teacher, and it sort of sets them back to a certain extent. We are looking into those other variables as well. We haven't quite figured it out. It's probably more than just age, and it turns out, as I mentioned, that some kids are doing better, whereas other kids sort of stay the same. And then there's a small percentage of kids who actually seem like they're getting increasingly challenged over time. And it's, they're all at the same age, but, other things are happening, or maybe it's part of their biology as well. We're trying to figure out all these variables to figure out why a child takes a particular trajectory. And of course, the $64 million question is, if we could figure that out and we could actually end up with a biomarker or some kind of indication, so that when the child is initially diagnosed at, say, 2 to 3 years of age, and we can say, based on these characteristics, we think this is the child that's going to be more challenged, then we can start a more intensive intervention right at the get-go. And that's really the ultimate goal of the Autism Phenome Project.
We have one other question that is related to that, which is, what is the sample size of the study that showed girls improved more?
Yeah.
Do you have it offhand?
Yeah, I believe it was about 125. It wasn't the entire subset of children, because we had to do the study on children that had assessments all at the same time points. So we have some kids who come in we call it time 1 at 3 years of age. Sometimes, for whatever reason, they skip a time point and then they'll come back for the next time point. So in this study, we were evaluating the group of kids that we knew had all the same assessments. It was well over 100.
Okay, we also have a story about this study, as well as the study itself. We could post in the comments if anyone wants to read a little bit more. And we will also post the link to the GAIN study, which Dr. Nordahl mentioned, which is focused on girls and autism. All three of you have been involved with this study for a really long time, at least 2 of you since the very beginning. I'm curious, from a personal perspective, what have you enjoyed most, or what's been the most meaningful part of being part of the APP? And I'd love to hear from all 3 of you. So maybe Dr. Solomon, you could start.
Well, as we've been talking about, the APP is a longitudinal study. And one of the beauties of a longitudinal study is that you get to know families really well, and you get to watch the children and the families really develop and change and, have successes over time. And so to me, longitudinal work is wonderful, as you get to watch families and children change. We're also able to be with the families to provide them with help along the way. All the assessments that we do, we're able to provide records of the assessments, and this helps families to get services for their children in the outside world. It gives them access to us, and we have lots of trained clinicians on staff who are always available to help when special problems come up. So I really enjoy the involvement with families and watching development unfold over time, because it's very often very positive. And when it's not, we're there to help.
Dr. Nordahl?
Well, of course, I agree with Dr. Solomon. I really enjoyed working with the families, and I'm thinking about what I appreciate most. And there's a couple things, but one thing I'll just mention is I'm absolutely blown away by the dedication that these families have shown to our study. You know, this is not an easy study to participate in. We've asked families to come in time and time again. When they're here, they're often going through multi-day assessments, a nighttime MRI scan, where sometimes we're there until 2 o'clock in the morning, waiting for kids to fall asleep. And in a large proportion of the families who participate in the study, as soon as we're done with one time point, they say, okay, what's next? When do we get to come back again? And that is just astounding to me. And I'm so appreciative of all of the families who've given their time and let us into their lives to really try to understand autism better and ultimately help autistic individuals everywhere.
Great. Dr. Emerald?
So I think I have two things. One, I want to echo what Christine and Marjorie were talking about, and that is, so I started off my career as a neuroscientist. The founding families of the Mind Institute used to call me a plain vanilla neuroscientist. And in the early years of the APP, I actually participated in the imaging of the children. And as Christine was saying, sometimes you start off at 8 o'clock and you don't actually do the scanning until 11. And in that time, you get to chat with the families. And really, a lot of my education about what autism is or what we should be looking for has come from those conversations with moms and dads and grandparents of family members. So that certainly is one of the things I've appreciated most. I think also, though, what I've appreciated is the collaboration with my colleagues at the Mind Institute. So when the Mind Institute was first started in late 1990s, the idea of the founding families was that we needed to have clinicians and scientists of different kinds working together in order to try and figure out the complexities of autism. And if anything, it's become ever more clear to me that autism is so complicated that no single individual, no single strategy, no single technique is actually going to provide the full answer. And what the Autism Phenome Project has been over its 15 or 16 years is a collaboration of wonderful clinicians and scientists of all kinds at the Mind Institute, and as well graduate students and postdocs and junior specialists who really have contributed to gathering all this data that how we have the luxury of being able to look at. So I think for me, equally the interaction with families, but the interaction with the colleagues at the Mind Institute.
Yeah, it's really an incredible project. It's a real honor to even be talking about it with you all. So thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Let's wrap up by asking what's next? This is by no means in its final stages. I know that participants can still sign up, actually, and we will post the email address if you're interested, as well as the link to the Autism Phenome Project webpage. But yeah, in terms of specific research projects or even just larger goals, maybe you could each talk about what's next. Maybe start with you again, Dr. Sullivan.
Sure. So two things are on my to-do list. First of all, we're taking a look at something that we found a signal for, which is that depression in all individuals through the lifespan tends to increase, as I was saying, in adolescence. And we're taking a look at a signal that depression may increase more in some people with autism than others. And that's really based on that trajectory work, where we find that kids that actually have less intellectual disability have more vulnerability to developing depression. So that's one thing we're very curious about. Another thing is that based on that work that I was telling you about, where we were looking for what differentiated children who go on to have really strong intellectual development versus those who don't, we think that going back earlier and looking more clearly and in depth at the kinds of things that are happening much earlier in development and in brain development. So Christine and I are really interested in taking on a project to kind of merge those two with the team into getting a clearer idea of what can really differentiate.
Sounds great. Dr. Nordahl, what's next for you?
Well, we are hoping and planning to enroll more girls into the study so we can continue to look at sex differences in brain development. In this next phase, we're looking really closely at the emergence of ADHD in school-age autistic girls. ADHD is another condition that's diagnosed less frequently in girls in the general population. And we actually know very little about the intersection between autism and ADHD in girls. And so that's on the horizon for us.
Excellent. And Dr. Emerald.
So I mentioned that some of the kids are coming back as teenagers. And so that actually is going to be a major effort for us over the next 3 to 5 years. We're hoping to bring back as many of the families that started with us many years ago for their 5th time point. We are going to be looking at a whole variety of factors. We're going to continue looking at anxiety. We're going to also be looking at some of the issues that Dr. Solomon mentioned before, that is how puberty affects the brain in a positive way. And we are starting a whole series of much more sophisticated analyses of the brain in terms of not looking at one part of the brain at a time. We've done a lot of that. As Christine said, we've looked at structures that are important like the amygdala that we know are important in anxiety. And we've shown that there's again, one of the ideas is that we want to see brain changes that we can map onto behavioral changes. And so we have done that with single brain regions over and over again. But we know that any complex behavior is not controlled by one brain region. There are networks of regions in the brain that are all speaking to each other. And we have very, very sophisticated ways now to be able to look at the network organization to see how that develops over time. And again, one of the exciting things in adolescence is that this is a period, it used to be thought that, the brain develops and sort of is fixed by, an early age. But we know that adolescence is a time of enormous plasticity and has the enormous potential for positive change. And so we're very interested in exploring, what is the status of networks and their development in autistic individuals, and then to what extent might we be able to modify in a positive way some of this network organization? So again, there's there's more questions than you can possibly answer about autism, but we are looking forward to welcoming back the families for this 5th time point and probing some areas that we just haven't been able to probe before.
Well, we were going to wrap up, but we did just get one more question in. If you have just a moment, we could answer that quickly. Does self-injurious behavior impact the depression in nonverbal individuals who also have intellectual disability? Has that been studied? Interesting question. Does anyone know the answer to that one?
In specific, we have not looked at it in the samples that we have, but it is definitely something that we plan to look at as we look more at depression in kids, in adolescents. And, one of the beauties of the Autism Phenome Project is we've been able to collect such very exquisitely detailed behavioral information. So self-injurious behaviors is definitely something we have. And since it's such a critical problem for families, it will definitely be something that we look at.
Great. So many questions to answer. We look forward to hearing about all of the next set of research papers that come out of the Autism Phenome Project. Thank you so much, Dr. Nordahl, Dr. Amaral, Dr. Solomon, for being with us today, for sharing your time and your expertise.
Very welcome. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all who've been watching for joining us for this UC Davis Mind Institute Facebook Live. And we encourage you to please share this post if you have family members or friends who you think would enjoy learning from it. Thanks for joining us.